This week on Podcast Perspectives, how do you know if the ad that you just bought in a podcast is working?
It's a much easier business to operate when there are, more folks out there evangelizing the fact that you need data to measure podcasting.
Welcome to Podcast Perspectives, a show about the podcast industry and the people behind it. I'm your host, Jeff Umbro, founder and CEO of the Podglomerate. Today on the show, we are chatting with Pete Birsinger, founder and CEO of Podscribe, as well as Cameron Hendrix, founder and CEO of Magellan AI. Both companies measure how effective your podcast ads are using prefix and pixel technology. In essence, you can see how many people heard your podcast ad and then went and purchased your product on a website. That's actually a very new and novel thing in the podcast industry, and it is what is helping the podcast industry to expand with a lot more brands. Historically, one of the larger companies in podcast measurement tech is called Chartable. Chartable is sunsetting as of this week and may have already sunsetted by the time you are listening to this show. Part of the reason that I wanted to have Pete and Cameron on was to discuss what happens next and what alternatives and opportunities there are for publishers today who want to continue to use this technology. We hope that it's helpful, and please reach out to us at listen@thepodglomerate.com if you have any questions about what you should be doing as a publisher.
I'm Pete, the founder and CEO of Podscribe. We provide measurement, verification, and research for all your podcasting and more broadly now audio needs.
I am Cameron. I'm one of the co-founders at Magellan AI. We are a platform for advertisers and publishers to accurately measure podcast performance and scale audio campaigns, trying to make sure that, we're helping advertisers understand, what's performing well and where they can scale and where they go next. And so we can ultimately all grow the industry together.
You guys run measurement companies that also have a bunch of tools that are derived from those measurements. Is that accurate?
I think that's a fair, statement. I think measurements it's a pretty broad term, right? So there's measurement in terms of actually looking at download data, and that's one aspect of it. There's also a measurement in terms of we prior to adding attribution, as a feature set, we were going back to 2017, starting to identify ads in podcasts, because back in the day, we were working with a network that was actually tracking, literally had a spreadsheet that they just would pass around and add names to the list whenever someone heard a new advertiser on podcasts. There was no visibility in the market as who was active. So I think there is, an aspect of measurement to that as well. But worth pointing out, we try to think about different sources as in one case, kind of being public, in another case being very confidential for the advertiser.
Both us and Magellan AI, we only, we didn't start with the measurement, the attribution side of things. Like Cameron's saying, I think his, their competitive intel was pretty revolutionary at the time. There was nothing else remotely like it whatsoever. And we started a bit there, maybe a bit more of a focus on the air check side of things for the buyers versus the research. But, we started, not in attribution at all, but then it became clear 2-3 years ago that there was now a huge hole in measurement with pod sites being acquired, and just, and the more we got into it, the more we sort of, I guess, really found was that nobody is really, there's still a lot more to be done in measurement. I wouldn't say brands are we nailed our podcast attribution, it's so solved. Even now, I don't get that impression from people. So it's good. There's still a lot more work to do, but I would say the foundation that we have of air checks and research, I think has helped us for sure. And I assume probably Cameron as well, build a better measurement product, because when it's all integrated, it's nice. You don't have to go to 3 different dashboards to see things. The system knows which episode had your ad. So there are definite advantages to having them being integrated.
So essentially, it's the data collection from the measurement turns into transparency and reporting for the different folks who want to use your services. Who are those folks? Am I correct in saying that it would be podcast publishers and podcast advertisers, or just advertisers and publishers in general?
Yeah, I think it is podcast publishers and advertisers. I think there's different aspects of the data that each of those different, types of companies lean into. So advertisers obviously looking at the market and trying to figure out where they should spend dollars and, accurately understand where they've, what's performed for them and where they should double down. On the publisher side, understanding, where advertisers are spending dollars is really important. And as well as kind of getting into, the weeds on measurement to make sure that the product that they're bringing to advertisers is really high quality as well. So yeah, it's definitely like both, I would say industry wide, right? In terms of like, there's a use case for everyone in the industry. The use case is typically a little bit different when we see them come to Magellan AI as to like what they actually ultimately want to get.
When we get clients' data for the measurement and the campaigns they give us, we do keep that separate, and we do have like a separate research database, you could say. So, when the client's giving us their campaigns, they don't have to worry, oh, this is going to just go out the other end and be in Podscribe's research for all the other advertisers. The research is computed in a bit of a different way, where we monitor the top shows and put the research out there. But yeah, I think it's still, the research is certainly, quite a useful product both for buyers and sellers. I think obviously, as a seller, to find who's spending where, perhaps to vet shows you may be acquiring. I think those two things are quite useful. But for buyers too, just to see what their competitors are doing and to make sure the show they're buying on, to see, are the advertisers that have found this show renewing? Are they have they been buying on, or just a lot of them trying it once and quitting? Or more recently too, to see the ad load. We put out a piece earlier this year with Oxford Road indicating, as ad load goes up, as a greater portion of an episode is ads, performance goes down, which is probably not the most shocking conclusion ever, but there was a definite relationship. So I think maybe that's entered a bit more on buyers' minds as they look at podcasts. So we'll show that data point. So useful to a variety of folks.
Yeah. Well, it's very funny to me because it's like with great power comes great responsibility, because you guys have access and provide access to the buyers and the sellers to like this mound of data that hopefully most people are like understanding what they're looking at. And as a publisher and a seller myself, it's kind of funny because I love the tools that you guys both provide. It's very useful. It's also terrifying because sometimes like you're like, am I gonna, match up to what I'm seeing here? And I don't know if you guys have thought about this very much, but like, what's the difference between Magellan and Podscribe? Like, what would make a good client for either platform as opposed to the other?
Magellan has been a bit more focused on publishers historically, and a bit more focused maybe on the research side of things. We had, at least from my perspective, more focus on the air checks and the verification side of things. So a lot of our clients have, I think we're maybe a bit more skewed, honestly, towards the buyer side, just because of our history with the verification. So I think there is sort of one piece there. I know, Cameron's, they've got a great research platform, and that's like historically, been pretty revolutionary on their side of things. I would say too, what I've heard in other cases is in some cases maybe we're a bit more willing, perhaps for better or worse, to do custom work for clients, depending on who it is, which I think is a pro and a con. I think in some cases maybe it means we have slightly too many features, or some of them, don't, some of them maybe aren't as like maintained or well announced as others, but we may be able to be more flexible.
So going back to 2017, when we launched, right, I was literally like having to convince the biggest folks in the industry to like take a call with me and like look at this thing that we've made. And like, it was not obvious that like, there was necessarily like an opportunity there. Like when you look at media markets overall and just like how things evolve, like IAS and Double Verify exist, right? And they coexist and compete and are direct competitors. And, we, Magellan AI, like compete directly with Podscribe. So I think that it's actually a good thing, for the industry, and honestly a good thing I'd rather be in a business. It's a much easier business to operate when there are, more folks out there evangelizing the fact that you need data to measure podcasting. So I think that's like, I always get asked like, Podscribe, what do you think about like, where they fit in the industry? And I'm always like, bring it in, let's do it. Like, this is like, the water's warm. This is awesome. And I think it's, only going to continue like as the industry grows. Like we had an opportunity early on to move, partially because the industry was small. And now it's growing. And I think as it grows, we'll see bigger players start to look at this space and get a lot more, serious about, podcast advertising as a channel, which means that, Pete and I are going to be like competing even more with each other and with bigger players. But, I guess going back to the kinds of companies that work with us. So I think we've focused on, partnering with brands in the context of helping them like scale campaigns. So we think it's really important to, accurately attribute like podcasts, which means like not over attributing, but also not under attributing results, so that you can identify what you should be, what kinds of podcasts you should be spending more on, where you should be going next.
What is the like value add for somebody working with your company? How are they like specifically using these different softwares?
For buyers, I'd say it's essential intelligence to make sure you're getting what you paid for and to know how your campaigns are performing for you.
And then you can use those learnings to determine like, I want to iterate and do this. I want to do more of that, less of this. As a publisher on my end, we get pixels from one or the other or both all the time. So on the sell side, Cameron, like what's your elevator pitch?
Yeah, elevator pitch. Well, you got to know what's running where and how to effectively understand performance. So publishers trust Magellan AI to grow ad sales, drive content acquisitions, make ad ops efficient, and ultimately measure performance of their campaigns so that they can articulate the value of their advertising to their clients.
It's also like every podcast publisher, right?
It is. It's pretty wide adoption. We were, again, very lucky to be as early as we were in the space. And I think the other really, again, fun thing about podcasting is that people tend to talk to each other and listen to each other. And I don't think I think it creates this like interesting space for companies like ours and companies like Podscribe to come in and like learn about people's challenges. And, there's a lot more openness. It feels like, I don't know, maybe it's because we're in an industry where we all talk to each other and listen.
It's also very new. I feel like we're all building the plane as it flies. But if you're explaining this to like a kid in high school, like how would you say that your services actually function?
So say you're BetterHelp and you're trying to find your ad that ran on the daily, hypothetically. What we'll do in that scenario is we will transcribe every episode of the daily, and then we'll label ads in our transcripts there. And then if we find a BetterHelp ad that matches roughly where their campaign is, we'll match it to their dashboard. So that's how we do the transcription and the air check side of things. And in the case where the episodes may be changing their ads, what we do is we take a snapshot of the episode. So we'll download it on Monday, and we'll retry it on Wednesday and then Friday, just so we take a snapshot at multiple times and transcribe each of those. So then people can see, is the ad going in and out, or maybe it was in this version, but not that version. So that's how that side of thing works. But on the measurement side, which maybe people are more interested in now, it works largely by matching IP addresses. So podcasting, for better or worse, does not have as much data as other channels. So for instance, if you're Google or Facebook, you likely have the person's email, you know more about them than they probably know themselves. But in podcasting, all that we can really see, or anybody can really see, is the IP address. So say, Jeff, you download an episode of the daily, and we're tracking that. All we'll see is, here's Jeff's house, his home IP address. Then if you, Jeff, go to betterhelp.com, say in the next week, and you're also on your home Wi-Fi, then, same IP. We saw get exposed to the BetterHelp ad and then go to the website. So by and large, it is on household matching. That's kind of the bulk of the
Cool.
The kid in high school is like an AP class. Yeah. He's like, ear checks.
He's like, man, I love data. Cameron, presumably Magellan works in a very similar fashion. I just picture a world where there are some people who hear that and they're like, that's terrifying. That is way too much information to give these guys. And then also a world where somebody's saying like, how the hell are they making any kind of decisions based on just that? Is that accurate? Do you ever have those conversations? Like, is this the happy medium that we all just have to accept? What are the other solutions that people are using in other industries? Why can't we do it? And like, is this good enough?
Prior to pixel-based attribution being an option for folks, the people were a lot more reliant on vanity URLs, promo codes. Those continue to be tools in an advertiser's toolbox, and I guess post-purchase survey as well. I think the data that we can bring to the table with pixel-based attribution just helps folks contextualize that a lot more. Like the problem is like setting up a business in general is hard. And so we've seen, many examples of, sometimes advertisers can be, it's hard to set it up right? So like you'll have an exit intent pop-up that, shows up with a promo code even after, someone has arrived at a vanity URL. Like, that's a small code change, but it has big impact in terms of metrics that you actually measure. So when we look at like pixel-based attribution, you kind of get a little bit more of a normalized sense because you're able to, do that linkage. But I think taking a step back and thinking about other industries, like I like to think about like TV as an example, like again, for our high school friend, we've got, you're sitting on your sofa, you turn on TV, probably your cord cutter, maybe the conversion happens on a device. Like you hear an ad on the YouTube TV and you go to a device and that's sitting in your hand or at the same time you're watching and you go to the website, right? Like that's effectively a response or a conversion event. So like industries like TV are having to solve challenges the same way that we are, in podcasting. I think the other interesting thing there, a while back, and I guess to some extent still, there's like a cookie apocalypse was like a very popular phrase to see in media. And I think the fun thing is like, as much as cookies haven't entirely gone away, and it seems like we went to the brink and then kind of came back a little bit, podcasting has never really had the full advantage of cookies the same way that like, Facebook and Google, they've been able to like do a lot of more direct linkage between someone clicking an ad and then like immediately having that browser navigate to that spot. Podcasting has always had the challenge of like the conversion happens on a device typically that's different than the device where the exposure happened in some cases. So I think the good news is the overall kind of media measurement industry as a whole outside of podcasting is having to look at solutions that podcasting has had to get comfortable with for a while. And that actually will help overall like drive growth in the market because marketers will come at it and instead of being like, what is this thing? They'll be like, oh, I had to think about this when we bought TV and I had to think about this when we bought this other channel. And it's going to be a little bit easier for them to digest.
So I think now everybody who's listening, our high school buddy, like he understands kind of like what we're all talking about. So now let's like bring in some real world examples. And Pete, I want to start with iOS 17 because this is something that you had a lot to do with. I know, Cameron, you also had a lot to do with. Pete, would you please explain briefly like what happened in September of last year and leading up to September of last year, and then like what the impact of that actually was?
The net effect is that there was a change within Apple Podcasts that made its listeners less often mass download the back catalog of shows. It had to do with what your settings were, with if you had auto download enabled and then you turned it back on, like after you had disabled it, it was kind of like, would you download then all the episodes in between? So in effect though, for at least the past 2-3 years, maybe longer, I'm not exactly sure when this behavior started in Apple Podcasts, but it had been going on for a while. And so the effect was that people would see, and we'd see this too, that Apple Podcasts had typically a higher frequency, maybe like the same amount of listeners as Spotify or other platforms, but just a noticeably higher frequency.
Sorry, you're defining listeners as like unique IP addresses, and frequency is like the number of downloads from each of these IP addresses. Is that mostly accurate?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. So then on certain campaigns, and usually these were run of show campaigns where the advertiser wouldn't just be buying the most recent episode. They would say, they would buy 100,000 impressions across the full back catalog of a show's episodes. So what we would see happen is, maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe a bit higher percent of impressions in that run of show buy would be going to say like a really small percent of listeners, like 2-3%. And it was sort of weird because it was like, why is the advertiser sending, a sizable portion of their campaign to just like, 7 people, maybe it was a few more, but a very small number of people. And what it turned out to be was that there was this sort of weird Apple scenario where if you toggle on and off your auto download settings, in some cases, you would just download a ton of a show's back catalog episodes. And then if the advertiser was doing a run of show buy, well, then that person would get 200 ads. If, depending on the show's back catalog size.
Presumably they're not listening to the ad and like acting on what they're hearing. And
They could listen, but odds were probably low that they weren't. The odds were a lot lower they were listening than to say just the most recent episode that they downloaded.
Pete's trying to be very political here and like safe, but you can assume that most people are not listening to those ads, and buyers were spending money on the ads that people were not listening to in many instances.
Well, and to your point, that actually what really made me think something was up, because some people are like, oh, it's noisy IPs, or it's people on an airplane, or, something. They're like, don't worry about it. But what kind of really made me look closer and have more confidence to say more things was that we compared the performance of those impressions, say that those 30% of impressions going to 2% of listeners. We compared the performance. How many conversions are coming from them compared to the rest? And we saw those impressions dramatically underperformed other impressions. So I was like, all right, well, even if we hypothetically it was all these people on an airplane or whatever, you would think they would still be converting, a bit. So the performance, to your point, was actually really what made us more confident that something what was up there. The advertisers, they weren't the best impressions for them to be buying on. So then when Apple made the update to make people less likely.
And they did this because you and a coalition of people like brought this to their attention, correct?
Right. I'd say Brian Barletta was certainly perhaps the most vocal, far more vocal than me. I know Brittany at BetterHelp was involved. A number of publishers were, involved. I think Sharon at Omni was talking to Apple. So yeah, I think there were a lot of people. I think the only thing I'd really say I know we played a sizable role in was sort of surfacing the data to buyers to say, like, are you aware this is happening? I think we could make your impressions more efficient if there was some way to fix this. So then, yeah, I think so then Apple was like, okay, maybe this isn't the ideal change, and maybe they did it for their users' bandwidth. Maybe they were trying to say, oh, maybe this person doesn't want 100 episodes of this show on their phone all of a sudden to mass download.
I've heard it explained as like at one point that was a feature back before everybody had like Wi-Fi everywhere that they went, but it was just a dated feature that like could potentially be viewed as a bug today. So what was the result of all of that?
The result was a great thing for advertisers, not so great for a number of publishers short term. But I think long term, it will come around for the publishers. So now typically for run of show buys, when an advertiser is buying across all the episodes of a show, we don't see the concentration nearly as much. The impressions are spread out much better than they were before. And interestingly, a lot of buyers, especially our direct response ones, would always say, baked in is way better, DAI, is terrible, doesn't work, blah, 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 which when we looked at the data, it did seem that way to us too. But with this update, I think actually it's come a lot closer, and in some cases has even flipped, which is good news, because I do think there is no inherent reason DAI should be worse than dynamically inserting an ad. There's no inherent reason it should be worse than baking an ad in. So I think there was this perception rooted in true performance that was holding the industry back from embracing this technology that actually can really help publishers monetize better. So now I think people's perceptions, I think, are kind of catching up to that. So great for advertisers in terms of performance, and publishers.
There's a huge conversation around like baked in versus like dynamically inserted ads versus faked in ads. And we're not going to talk about it on this episode because it would take us all day. The crux of what Pete is saying is that historically buyers have not wanted to run dynamically inserted ads as much as they would have liked to have done like a faked in or a baked in, because it didn't perform as well. And with this update, like they are performing a lot better because presumably there's less like junk downloads that are going into them. This change, in some cases, I've seen had a like very significant like impact on many publishers. I've seen anywhere from like 20 to 50% of downloads getting cut off from these things, depending on the show, because this adversely impacted older shows or shows that publish more frequently. And that means that publishers are going to make less money and like maybe have to make decisions based on like that new reality. And then the second side of that is that long term, buyers are going to spend more money because they're more confident that their ads are going to actually work, which is excellent. Cameron, I know we just took up a lot of time, but Is there anything that you want to like add to that? And I'm also curious about if you were involved at any point in like, that whole conversation.
In terms of like buyer confidence, I think we still, the reality is like to some extent it's like confidence coming from the fact that like we caught, one issue with downloads, right? But because we caught the one, it's like you look at data and you're like, I caught the one thing, so I feel pretty good about this. The challenge is that advertisers and people who come to the channel who are like fresh to the channel, like are still looking at like they don't really. There's the perception that's like, listen is what matters. The fact that someone is like actually hears an ad, right? And like that's been one of the challenges in the space is that like there've been efforts to like kind of support or adopt effectively like kind of play markers that like cause someone to know if an ad was really delivered. To some extent, some of the streaming, DAI, dynamic ad insertion technology, like can address some of this. But like I think all that's to say is I think there are probably still some, confidence, boosters that like we will ultimately go through. I think the taking a step back, right? The thing that changed was like the kind of dollar amount that advertisers were spending, on those podcast ads, because some of those impressions were, effectively like caused by this, feature or bug in Apple Podcasts. The thing that did not change was like the actual like outcomes, right? Which is part of what pixel-based attribution helps you measure in the first place, is like the actual like purchases and leads and other metrics that you might care about as an advertiser.
The measurement shifted, but the actual like number of folks who in reality were listening did not change at all.
Right. So the ROAS changed, right? The percentage, return on advertising spend, which is honestly great for advertisers, right? Like it's, more bang for their buck, right? But yeah, like the whole, and part of the power that I think, we and Podscribe bring to the table, Magellan AI and Podscribe bring to the table, is the fact that you can measure conversions and, feel confident that you can link up exposure, on podcast ads to conversions and look at the absolute level of dollars that you're getting back from podcasting as a channel and decide whether that makes sense for you to continue investing in, based on lift and based on these other metrics that, we deliver, to advertisers. So, and going back to like, I think we were back involved as part of the IAB Tech Lab and as part of like working with Sounds Profitable and Brian Barletta, big shout out for basically pushing this through. I think ultimately the, interesting, like I said, the industry itself like came together to solve this problem. And I think it is like does increase, confidence overall, but I think we still have a ways to go to make sure that people understand that like what they should be caring about is outcomes as much as they care about like obviously the metric that trades.
The big reason I wanted to have you guys here is to talk about everything that we already covered. But like the crux of it was really just the idea that Chartable is sunsetting. When this episode comes out, that will be like right around the corner. So even when people are listening, that may have already happened. First of all, why Spotify purchased Chartable in 2022? They took a lot of the great features that they loved. And so like, in your opinion, why did they purchase the platform? And in your opinion, why are they now shutting it down? And then we'll talk about what comes next.
I think they made a real power play 2-3 years ago, however long it was, to buy both of the two more or less leading attribution companies. I think they, figure to some degree, all right, we're just going to bring in-house all the main attribution, and all of the, key advertisers are going to mostly have to run through us. So we're going to get tremendous amount of data in the space and, on all these other shows and publishers that aren't even ours. And it'll be a great lead gen for new advertisers. And I think perhaps another thing they thought was, they kind of really needed a in-house analytics solution for their internal strategic plans. So maybe that could have been even the biggest reason of them all, perhaps. And perhaps it was because I think what a lot of buyers have noticed with Spawn and Chartable is just the rapid dilapidation of the products in the support teams. I think there's like there's not a lot of people over there still doing much with them. And I think buyers have really noticed it. I think free is great. Like sort of like Cameron was saying earlier, I think it's great having SPA out there because it gets buyers a little bit comfortable with the space in a free setting. And, maybe there are some bugs and no support, but like, still it gets people in the space and using it. Were you going to say something, Jeff?
I was just going to say SPA is Spotify Ad Analytics,
right?
Formerly Pod Sites. They changed the name. So
Right. I think they did perhaps see a bit more of a recoil from buyers and publishers over the solutions not being independent, and that Spotify was in a way grading their own homework if you're buying on Spotify, and then they're also telling you how well it performed. I think there was a bit of recoil there, and also from other publishers who didn't perhaps love the idea of sending Spotify their data on their shows, which how they performed, how many downloads. I don't think there was a lot of that was widely loved by other publishers. So there's definitely I think a bit of a that I think that maybe surprised them. I don't know. Maybe they were fully expecting that, but it seems like where they're really powering away is taking the internal tech and repurposing it in some shape or form for their own strategic ambitions, perhaps to be a bit like a YouTube with its own, measurement and things. So, but yeah, I think Chartable had a good run.
They did. And you guys at Podscribe are also going to, or have launched your own solution for like podcast to podcast attribution and podcast to web attribution and your version of Smart Links. Did those exist before Chartable sunset?
They've been around for about a year and a half, I would say, but both of them. So they have been around. I would say our main focus has been advertiser attribution for this time, but they have been there. And now with this surge of, demand from the Chartable sunsetting, we have now slotted like a number of upgrades and additions to them to make them more reliable, more robust, add more analytics to them. So they've been around for some time.
You two are going to have a really great Q4.
Yeah, no, but so they've been around, but we have a number of things planned that some we've already released, a number of updates to them to put a fresh face on, be prepared for anybody who wants to give them a shot.
And what's the plans for the future of the platform?
Well, I think there's still a lot of room for improvement and measurement with just podcasting and streaming audio. You talk to so many brands, and I mean, a lot of our clients, maybe they've figured it out more than other people, but I think there's still a lot better we could do with it to grow confidence in the industry and measurement. A lot more ways we could slice it. Incrementality has become a really hot thing recently, very convincing to people. So we've had a solution for that and continuing to improve that. And then I think spreading out a bit to adjacent channels, say CTV, we're starting to do a little bit of it now, but I think what can really help podcast buyers convince their boss or company that, hey, this is working, is if they see also the overlap between the two and how podcasting is fitting in with other channels. And if the more podcasting measurement can be put apples to apples with other channels, and it can be proven how effective it is. So we want to have more integrations with other channels to show podcasting on the same footing, because I think that is really needed as well. So better improvement for audio and more integration with other channels to make it easier for people to compare it apples to apples.
Would you ever launch a marketplace?
No desire. No desire. An ad server that sits atop all the publishers, because there's no way right now, except maybe if you're buying through the trade desk where the inventory may be limited, to say frequency cap across all publishers, for example, or to say maybe you have listeners reached on one show and you want to not target them again on another. There's not really a way to do that. So I think maybe down the line we'll look, what kind of solution we could assist with or be part of there, because I think an ad server that sits atop another layer could unlock a lot for buyers, but I'd say that's a bit in a dream state still.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but that would be kind of like AdSwiz before Sirius bought them.
Right. I'd say in a way, but I'd say imagine if a buyer could have what's sort of similar to their Facebook dashboard, where they can control all their buys through it and pause, switch creatives, frequency cap, say I want to do more here, where could give buyers like an unprecedented level of control. Because right now they're sort of at the mercy of the publisher ad servers to do this or that.
Spotify tried to do that and it didn't work very well. I think that they're actively doing that, actually. Like, anybody can go and buy audio spots on Spotify.
Well, Spotify, clearly super important part of the ecosystem, big ambitions to, make audio, a channel, that advertisers like come to and specifically through Spotify. So I think, it was, I don't have a crystal ball into, the folks at Spotify were thinking back in, was it 2022? All the kind of pieces to this fell into place, or maybe it was late 2021 for Chartable and Pod Sites to become part of Spotify. I think, what's been interesting though, is as much as there's been some pushback around, the measurement of ads, using, Spotify analytics among certain publishers. Like a lot of those publishers we're still like relying on Chartable. So, the number of folks who've come out of the woodwork who had, you otherwise would kind of expect had maybe moved on in the past, had still really been like kind of plugged into that feature set, which I think speaks to what an incredible job Chartable did, like getting out there in the market, with their offering. And also what an incredible job they did, like kind of building, and hats off to, and Dave and team at Chartable from the time, like building feature sets that were, even after, maybe not a ton of like upgrades and like recent, months and years, and obviously heading into this deprecation effectively, still tools that people love and appreciate. So probably the reality is like business needs change over time. And, Spotify is clearly like, rolled out Spotify and analytics as a, solution to replace a lot of the kind of pieces of, Podsights and Chartable that they had, seem to have kind of repackaged and redeveloped into that new product offering. So I think it's probably something that was like the writing was on the wall from the beginning. It's hard to say.
We are in a really funny situation because, to your point, like we have all been very reliant on this one tool. There are other platforms that exist, including Magellan and Podscribe, that do many of the same things, but I've not found anything that does all of the same things. And most of the publishers who were using Chartable were using it for some version of these like 6 features that they have.
I would also say all of the same things at the same price point. So I think there's there's something to be said for that, right? And the fact that like the product offering that existed most recently was maybe not something that like was sustainable for the ecosystem overall.
That's a great point. And I honestly haven't thought about it in that way. What Cameron is referring to is that Chartable was offered for free to anyone who used Megaphone, and for a pretty realistic price point for anybody who didn't. Whereas most of the other services that are out there are somewhat based around bandwidth costs. So like the bigger publisher you are, the more money you are going to spend. And as we just discussed for an hour, like it is pretty essential to be tracking all of the data when it comes to like your podcast to web or podcast to podcast attribution, so that you can see like which marketing campaigns are working, whether you're a brand or a publisher. There's a lot of people who are all of a sudden going to be paying a lot more money in 2025 than they were in 2024 for the exact same service that they also still have to learn and like reintroduce into their ecosystem. What are you guys doing differently when it comes to pod attribution or like another Chartable feature?
The advantage is that like we have built the platform having a lot of knowledge from what other customers who've like used tools like Chartable have had pain points around. So we've been able to develop metrics like we take converted listeners, right? So basically the number of listeners that you're driving from a promo, and we break that into one-time listeners and repeat listeners. So a one-time listener is anyone who's accessing that, even if you access it over like on a Tuesday, you start an episode on Tuesday and you finish it on Thursday, we're calling that's a one-time listener. A repeat listener is someone who's come back to multiple episodes, like at least 2 episodes of a podcast after being exposed to a promo, which is obviously a little bit more like subscription, like, behavior change among like a listener. You're ultimately getting hopefully a longer term listener, and we're able to like measure that metric. And I think that's something that like Chartable had like not done, and we were able to kind of take a step further. And then similarly, like our replacement for smart links, we call listen links. So listen links sit for us alongside podcast promos in a way that like was a little bit different. So Chartable had kind of like a module for smart links, a module for smart promos. For us, we're kind of seeing it as like ultimately part of the same, data deliverable, right? So you can take the same metrics like downloads and converted listeners, one-time listeners, repeat listeners. You get those metrics from listen links as much as you get them from the podcast promos. We put that data side by side.
What is the future for Magellan?
The fun thing about podcast advertising and podcasting is that like there's no shortage of ideas. And I think one of the weird things, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's normal, but one of the weird things about like this business in particular has been there has been no shortage of things that I want to build. I think if anything, like the list is longer than ever and we've built more than ever. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue to develop tools and you try to solve like industry problems when it comes to, advertisers trying to spend dollars efficiently, publishers trying to measure the effectiveness of those dollars. And a lot of that has to do with changes like in the ecosystem that are just happening, outside of us, which is great, which is things like, the rise of programmatic. Like we rolled out a feature to identify programmatic ad campaigns. So programmatic ads have been around for a while as a smaller portion of the market. If you look at like things like the IAB revenue studies, but programmatic, we're kind of rolling out some technology that for the first time allows you to see, what shows are part of, span and, what campaigns have run across those different kinds of solutions in the marketplace and on run of network buys and things like that. So those kinds of changes in the industry have kind of caused us to like, prioritize, improvements, around that. And then similarly on the measurement side, we're really excited about tools like ReachLift, which we launched with Wondery, and the expansion of, the adoption of understanding like reach and the unique reach that each network brings to the table in the industry. I think kind of taking a step back, right? Like the longer term, where podcasting is going to fit in among more channels that are today bigger, like CTV and TV buying and even broadcast buying. And so we are, I think, ultimately going to be looking at like ways to bring our tools to more channels to help advertisers who are in podcasting who work with us today scale in other channels as well. And I think it's like, not a surprise, shouldn't be a surprise really for anyone to hear that, right? It's like, like media tech companies tend to grow, right, by adding feature sets that serve their industry and also by adding, support for scaling in other channels. And I think we'll kind of follow a similar path to what the giants who have come before us have done in terms of scaling, our solution for podcasting and channels beyond that.
This is very cool. I'm really glad that both of you were able to join the show today, and thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, it's super fun. Thank you for having me, and always great to chat.
Really great to be on here. Appreciate you having me. Cameron, a pleasure as always. Good seeing you.
Always.
Thank you all for joining us on the show this week. For more podcast-related news, info, and takes, you can follow me on Twitter at Jeff Umbro. Podcast Perspectives is a production of the Podglomerate. If you're looking for help producing, marketing, or monetizing your podcast, you can find us at podglomerate.com. Shoot us an email at listen@thepodglomerate.com or follow us on all social platforms at Podglomerate or Podglomerate Pods. This episode was produced by Caitlin Bogucki, Chris Boniello, and myself, Jeff Umbro. This episode was edited and mixed by Jose Roman. And thank you to our marketing team, Joni Deutsch, Madison Richards, Morgan Swift, and Annabella Penna. And a special thank you to Dan Christo and Tiffany Dean. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you all in 2 weeks.